Fantasy sports. You love it. Now live it.
Sometimes a fantasy, is all you need.
Into the upper court. A huge, big fly.
Got a free one and another monster jam.
He's in front. Score!
Sirius XM Fantasy Sports Radio. Sirius 210, XM 87.
Snap to Matt Flynn. Here comes the blitz. Flynn over the middle. Got Driver cutting left to the 20. He's gone. Touchdown. Donald Driver. 35-yard and a Lambeau leap to the south end zone stands. Right through the heart of the gutless Lions.
Featuring the combined power of hundreds of fantasy sports websites. This is Big Lead Sports on Sirius XM Fantasy Sports Radio.
You know, Sweet, I like what you did right there. Don't know what you got till it's gone on a little Matt Flynn action. You've got Big Lead Sports on Sirius XM Fantasy Sports Radio, Sirius 210, XM 87. He's Corey Bonini. I'm Ryan Bonini. We're joined by our special guest right now, Chris Anthony from Fantasyomatic.com. Tremendous fantasy sports resource. And Chris also happens to be a big Packers fan, where he's been shedding a few tears and beers the last couple of weeks since the loss. But now he also just lost his offensive coordinator, and his backup quarterback probably isn't that far off. Where are you at on the whole Flynn situation, Chris? Is this guy a bona fide fantasy quarterback moving forward, depending on the situation?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, let's temper our expectations. Everybody thinks we have this 1 week sample. We actually have a 2 week sample, so it's double what everybody expects. Now, granted, in one of those 1 weeks, he broke a Packers franchise record for throwing passing touchdowns, which is actually pretty impressive for that particular franchise. Just a lot of number of years there. But he also performed very well. He got on everybody's radar when he filled in for in one of the concussion games, for Rodgers when they went into New England and played a streaking Pats defense at the time, much better than this year's defense, and he performed admirably well and arguably almost won that game. But of course, almost only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. But yeah, he's ready for the starting role. It's really been an assumption even before this season that he was going to be someone who was going to be a starting quarterback somewhere else. But now when you throw in the Philbin moving down to Miami, I think everybody just is kind of putting two and two together and saying, wouldn't Matt Flynn be a great guy there? Obviously, Miami's hungry for a franchise quarterback, and I think he's going to really perform well there, especially if he can fit right into the system that he already knows. He's gotten a lot of accolades for actually knowing the system very well, and you've seen that in the opportunities that he's gotten to play. There's also some interesting impact when it comes to Green Bay as well. He's a free agent, obviously, which is why we're having this discussion. But Green Bay's got an interesting decision to make, and if you've been following some of the Green Bay news, you'll know that they have a choice to make on who they're going to franchise this year. And it really boils down to Jermichael Finley, who's really the front runner in the franchise tag discussion, or Matt Flynn now, all of a sudden after Week 17. He's in the discussion. There's been some talk recently that Jermichael Finley actually will end up with some kind of a deal. He's probably more affordable than he was going into this season just because of some of the drops, actually being number 4 in the NFL in drops for pass-catching tight ends. But if Green Bay ends up putting the tag on Flynn, that means that if they don't get rid of him, they'd have to pay him about $14.5 million, and their star quarterback Aaron Rodgers is only making $8 million. So that could make for an interesting gamble. But if they do get rid of him, they could end up with a first-round tender. And with teams like the Redskins even in the mix looking for quarterbacks out of free agency, that might be something that could actually happen. So a lot of Packer faithful hope that he gets the franchise tag and that potentially another first-round pick comes out of that. So that's one of the interesting things, but I think there's going to be a particularly good click when it comes to him following Philbin down to Miami if that happens.
Now, Chris, let's jump over here to the Chuck Pagano hiring with the Indianapolis Colts. I mean, obviously, we still have a long way to go with the Peyton Manning saga here. What do you think Pagano does for the Colts as far, obviously a defensive guy? Do you think he's an immediate upgrade to help that maligned defense? And then on the other side of the coin, it looks like Dean Pease will replace him with the Ravens. How do you see that playing out?
Well, I think we can see Irsay's cards here. Ever since he took over for the old man, he's been pulling defensive-oriented coaches into the head coaching position over there, and he's done it once again. This time he went to a extremely stout defense and a scheme that's worked for many years down in Baltimore, pulling a guy in, and he's hoping to really rebuild that entire defense there. It might involve, changing the scheme, but at this point, honestly, I don't think there's a single thing in Indianapolis that's not open for discussion at this point, including, of course, Peyton Manning. Pease seems like the logical guy. I think at this point he's considered very likely to be the next defensive coordinator, but the reason that he's most likely going to be that guy is because they love their scheme there. He's the linebackers coach. He's the closest guy to a defensive coordinator, next down the org chart. He does have some coordinator experience, of course, having worked with the same role under Bill Belichick in New England for a few years. But the Ravens are going to have a hole in that position, and I think that Pease is actually going to be the guy, and you're going to see very little change in the way that defense operates as a result of it. But I think Pagano's going to be an interesting cog in the wheel. Many different pieces of that puzzle still yet to come, but they're going to really focus on holding up that defense with some of the personnel that they've got already.
He is Chris Anthony from Fantasyomatic.com. Chris is basically a walking database, if you haven't been able to tell yet. He just spouts these numbers off that impress me all of the time. We were talking about it during the break. I know numbers. I don't come close to knowing numbers like Chris does. And speaking of those numbers, Chris, moving forward, obviously, it's not too long before all of you guys are starting to crunch the numbers for fantasy football rankings for 2012. Before that's going to be the schedule. I know Corey is neck deep all the time in KFFL.com's rankings. How much do you put schedule play actually into your ranking basis many, many months before the teams ever even are completely where they're going to be entering the upcoming season?
Well, interestingly, we're all starving for metrics, something that we can project forward. Schedule metrics are most accurate in week 17 of any season. That's easy to say from a numbers perspective. But the further you go back towards the beginning of the season, of course, the less accurate they get, and that includes if you start looking at things when the schedules come out in March. But we have been able to see some things where an offensive position that is projected very, very early in the off season when the schedules come out as having, let's say, the best or the second, or not the best, but the second easiest or the first easiest schedule against their position. We seldom see them swing 15, 20 positions in the other direction. So it does give us some insight there. But over at the site at Fantasyomatic.com, what we spend a lot of time doing, we get the schedules into our system, and then we start crunching every little aspect of it. I think we had 1,050 different variables that we put into it that affected the rankings from the end of the season last year. Of course, we have our algorithm, our proprietary algorithm that works in to that as well. But we put in things like these coordinator changes like we're talking about, offensive personnel changes, all these different types of things, and all those go into a system that weights against the schedule. And then, believe it or not, we reshuffle that schedule deck right after week 3. There's sort of a mathematical reason why 3 weeks of a data sample is required to project forward. But basically, we use the March schedule information for determining draft order and some kind of bubble decisions that you might need to make when you're deciding on drafting players from the same position. And then we really, really, really lean on it after week 3 of the regular season for fantasy purposes.
Now, how often do you find yourself struggling where the numbers come out and you just, they're eye poppers and you go, wow, that just can't be right, and you crunch again and it still comes out to be something that seems, almost, unattainable. I remember when Aaron Rodgers took over for Brett Favre several years back, crunching the numbers, I was going, wow, this guy's a top 3 fantasy quarterback. And we just, at the end of the day, we just didn't have the, guts to really project that. So we brought him down to, I think it was 8 or 9 in our rankings. He still had a very solid season. A lot of people were happy because of that. But have you run into that scenario in the last couple of years? Does anyone stand out to you?
Well, yeah. It happens all the time. Where that really kind of tricks us is when it comes to rookies, for example, because those are the toughest guys to gauge. And, depending on what the position is, you can't really lean on them too heavy in their first year. Again, depending on the position, of course. But sometimes we find, before the draft even happens, we'll run schedule, we'll do some of the metrics that tell us, here's a position. There's not even a guy in the position yet, and this person should be able to do pretty well or not do that well either way. So what happens is you got to have to kind of disconnect yourself from that, because a lot of times we're sitting there at the draft going, come on, Chargers, whoever you take as your next running back is going to be, the best running back of the season, and that guy ends up being Ryan Matthews, and he barely gets 5 games out of him. So a lot of the reality of real football out on the gridiron comes into play when you're looking at some of these things. But yeah, there's some real sleepers that pop in. A lot of times it's the young guys, because there's not much you can really bank on with them except for who they're going to be facing. Really, this has been, we're heavily invested in this as one of the metrics. It's a big influence, I should say, in what we come up with in our algorithm. But it's not a deal breaker. I mean, a lot of times you're looking down the barrel of a guy who's got a great season, like this year. One of the best projected schedules of any quarterback in the NFL, Chad Henne. So I think that maybe answers your question right there. You can't just go by this data alone, that's for sure.
Don't be picking on my Michigan quarterbacks. Come on,
Hey.
Chris. We were doing so well on Wednesday night.
I'm sorry.
He is Chris Anthony of Fantasyomatic.com, a tremendous resource. This is his first Wednesday with us. I'm sure he will be joining us again. Chris, why don't you tell everybody what's going on over at the website?
Yeah, certainly. Once the Super Bowl wraps up, we're going to be releasing some interesting content looking forward. Our annual What We've Learned article for different approaches and things and some studies and different data that we've analyzed, and also closer looks at streaming DSTs. We've got some really interesting data that's going to be coming out there, and also this theory that we've got that's really kind of catching some fire. And that's drafting number 2 wide receivers instead of number 1s. And we've got a whole study that we're working on already to share with people on that. So all that stuff's coming out shortly after the Super Bowl. Give us a follow on Twitter at Fantasyomatic to be able to find out when we're actually releasing all that stuff. But we're working hard on it right now and just waiting for the season to officially be over after the Super Bowl before we start looking forward.
I'm on Chris's website at least 3-4 times a day. Tremendous information. Some of his reports make my eyes pop out, but it's typically as accurate as it's going to get. Chris does a fantastic job. Chris, man, thanks for joining us as you do each and every week in some level here on the Big Lead Sports shows, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, maybe a little Thursday night action in the coming weeks. Tremendous information as usual, man. We appreciate it.
I look forward to it. Thanks so much for having me, guys. Take care.
Oh, hey, Chris, real quick, I got to get your prediction for the game.
Patriots, 2 points.
Patriots, 2 points. All right, I'm thinking I'm going to edge with you on that one. So we're going to see. So, all right, man, we appreciate it. You have yourself a great night.
You too. Take care.
He is Chris Anthony of Fantasyomatic.com. Again, go check out the website. Chris does a great job breaking down all the numbers. Walking encyclopedia of numbers. He is a database. We're going to get into it more coming up after this with KFFL.com's Tim Heaney.